Hello everyone, and welcome to the third panel of RSK COP27 event Climate Finance. I'm Professor Ian Thompson and I'll be chairing today's discussion. As a little introduction, I'm in sustainability at the University of Birmingham. I'm also director of the Centre for Responsible Business here, and I'm also convener of the Centre for Social Environmental Accounting Research, a global network of scholars exploring this really critical area of climate finance and climate accounting. I've been sort of researching climate finance and climate accounting for over 30 years now, and it is really positive to see how it's actually now starting to move to the top of the political and business agenda. I think now what needs to be done, we know how we can progress things and who needs to act. But the problem is that one of the ways of inaction, there seems to be a lack of knowledge, maybe arguably ignorance on the importance of these things. And there's also kind of errors of ineptitude where we're perhaps applying the wrong solutions to the wrong problems. So today, I think there's an urgency for action. There's a need to what we want to try and do in the panel is share some solutions, explore some pitfalls to be avoided, and actually maybe identify some knowledge gaps that need to be filled in. And before we start, I just like a little kind of discussion on social media and housekeeping. We'd love you to share the event. We'll be kind of putting up online the sort of like the details on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. All attendees' microphones are all. When we start the discussion, you can post questions, and there will be a Q&A session. You can, of course, raise questions throughout the discussion, but please bear in mind as many questions as possible will be answers. Apologies if we don't manage to make it all. We will try and get through to it. And then you will at the end of you'll receive a short survey, which we'd really like you to kind of to fill in. I'm speaking to you from Scotland, about 50 miles away from Glasgow, where COP26 happened. And we're here to discuss kind of climate finance a year on, which is top of the agenda of COP27. Now, in 2009, when the world leaders met in Copenhagen for COP15, developed countries pledged $100 billion every year to the nations most impacted by the climate crisis. Question is the extent to which that pledge has actually been delivered, because only recently a group of 77 countries made up of developing nations and their supporters called for this pledge to be finally met and for a financial mechanism for losses and damages to be established. So go back to my my point. There's an urgency for action. There's a sense of we know what's actually been done, but actually things are maybe not being done. And today I'm joined by 4 experts who are going to share their thoughts on what needs to be done, what needs to come from COP27 to ensure all countries and their people are protected from climate change. First up, we have Dr. Robert Charnock, Director of the Metis Institute, speaking to us from Singapore.
Hi there, Ian. Yes, thank you. And good evening from Singapore. Good morning to everybody around the world, I suppose. I'm guessing for most people joining the call. I'm Dr. Robert Charnock. I am the Director of the Metis Institute for Climate Strategy. We're a research institute that focuses on really the infrastructure that underpins a lot of climate finance as we move into this new area of regulatory requirements. We look at things, everything to do with the strategies that companies have for their transition to net zero, through to climate risk management, and also underneath that, a lot of work around carbon offsetting and carbon markets. And I should also flag that most recently, something relevant to this panel is Ian and I guest edited a special issue of the Social and Environmental Accountability Journal, entirely focused on the role of research on climate finance in informing what the IPCC talk about on how to really drive action worldwide, because we know the climate science is there. What we need now is the best research possible to drive action and guide that action.
Thank you. Next up, we have Claire Elston, Director of Capital Markets at CDP. I believe you can tell us where you're speaking from, but I think it's from the UK. But great to have you here, Claire.
Thanks, Ian, and it's really great to be with you. Yes, I'm Claire Elston. I'm the Global Director of Capital Markets at CDP. I'm usually based in the UK, so you're correct, but actually today I'm in Tanzania, in East Africa. So forgive me if my internet connection drops in and out a little bit. So as I mentioned, I'm from CDP. Hopefully most of you will know, but for those that don't, we're the global disclosure platform. So last year, over 13,000 companies disclosed to us, aligned with TCFD in a comparable and consistent fashion, which is a really important supporting strand of ensuring that we're able to provide banks, investors, and anyone with an axe to grind within the capital markets ecosystem with the information they need to be able to make investment decisions, financing decisions, and understand the risks and opportunities around the companies that they're interacting with. So we have over 680 signatories who are banks, investors, etc. Like I said, supporting our program. Who represent over $130 trillion of assets under management, and we equip them with the data that we seek through our disclosure program and engage with them to more intrinsically embed sustainability factors within their processes. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we're joined by Dr. Yvonne Maninge-Muruki, who's done a kind of sterling job on trying to beat a blackout, and actually has had to run around trying to find a generator so she could join us. Very kind of relevant for climate finance, energy security. Claire, founder and chief executive officer of Kyle Climate. Claire, sorry, Yvonne.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, absolutely. Speaks to the core developmental challenges that we need to address as part of climate finance. But anyway, I'm really happy to be here today. I'm speaking to you from Nairobi. My name, as Ian mentioned, is Dr. Yvonne Maninge-Muruki. By way of my background, I have a PhD in climate change and adaptation, but started off as an environmental lawyer. But I soon realized that here in Kenya, there was a need for knowledge and capacity around mainstreaming climate change into core decision-making processes, particularly for the private sector. And so that's how I started my startup, Kyle Climate. We've been operational for 3.5 years now, and we are supporting a range of private sector clients to integrate climate risk into their planning, to also think strategically through their corporate social responsibility and ESG budgets and plans, as a way of actually getting the right amount of money to the communities that need it. So really excited to be here and share the learnings that I've had over the past couple of years, because I think we need to hear more from this side of the world. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And now we're traveling even further east over to Pom Manu-Amorn, who's a climate and finance expert. Pom.
Thank you, Ian, and hello to everyone from Bangkok. So my name is Dr. Onsaran Pom Manu-Amorn, or I go by Pom for short. I'm currently wearing multiple hats right now. In Thailand, I'm an advisor to the Thailand's Fiscal Policy Research Institute, working on the issue of climate change, SDGs, and sustainable finance. I'm also a consultant to a few international development organizations working on financing low carbon and climate resilient development. Currently doing some projects for the World Bank and also Climate Bonds Initiative. My professional background has been with multilateral development banks. I'm a social scientist by training, and I have done my PhD research on international adaptation finance, looking in particular at the role of international climate funds. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Okay, thank you. Let's start off the discussion with perhaps a provocative question, start the debate. Countries across the world have been waiting on the pledge of $100 billion per year since COP. Now we get ready for COP27. I really want to ask you all, if climate finance is going to be transformative, what must it do that it's not doing already? And I'd like to start with Rob, then I'll move to Claire, Yvonne, and then Pom on this one.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, okay. So for climate finance to be transformative, okay, I would say that the most crucial aspect of this is really ensuring that climate finance is also just. And what this means is ensuring that there is the reasonable and fair distribution of climate finance, but also access to those funds as well. I mean, there's so many issues that can be discussed, as we will today, but really I think what you've seen in the last couple of decades of climate finance is that where finance has been channeled, you've had a large amount going into mitigation projects, as is required for the issue. But what there is there's this really growing realization that we have locked in a lot of these impacts of climate change already. And as a consequence, we are going to have to adapt. So as this adaptation side of climate finance takes off and we see growing amounts of funding going towards climate adaptation projects, the question is really who has access to it? Because what you typically find is that it can often be projects, okay, it can be focused on developing nations, but it's not always the people who need it most who have access. The most vulnerable communities, the poorest communities, they don't always have the technical expertise needed to access that funding. They don't know the funding's available. So you can often find a lot of this funding ends up sort of in the middle income parts of developing countries too. So I think there's really a big question of ensuring that the climate finance that is being made available to these projects is finding its way to the most vulnerable communities. And a critical part of that is going to be facilitating access, because so far that's been a really critical challenge in the recent decades on climate finance.
Okay, thanks for lots of issues coming up there. Claire, what's climate finance going to have to do?
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I totally agree with everything Rob just said. I think from my perspective, what needs to happen is, firstly, we need to see a great deal more urgency than we are at the moment. At the moment, we just aren't seeing it. Certainly from our research, no G7 index is aligned to even a 2-degree scenario at the moment, let alone a 1.5 degree. Most economies in the G7 are aligned to more like a 2.7 degree scenario. So something is still not landing with companies or with regulators to an extent. There's not the urgency there to demand change, and we're not seeing it, certainly with the financial institutions who certainly are not pricing the risk correctly. So I would suggest that the urgency factor really needs to be picked up on significantly if we're going to see some major change. I'd say one of the other things is we need to really bring this idea of climate finance into the mainstream. And not view it as more of a side project. Given the urgencies that I've mentioned, given the existential threat that we're facing, we need to start seeing a greening of entire financial systems, not just silos. So what would actually go to serve that? Well, certainly from a CDP perspective, what we can see is that there's still far too much fragmentation in the market. We've got over 28 different taxonomies. So we need to see more alignment, more consistency, more comparability. We're looking forward to the ISSB release very soon, I believe, of a new sort of baseline of disclosure standards, which is going to be important. But of course, that will need to be modified to certain different jurisdictions. But we need to see more comparability. Certainly, as I mentioned before, we had over 13,000 corporate disclosures last year through CDP. That's fantastic. It's grown significantly year on year. We haven't yet released those numbers yet. But the last thing I'd say is those are mostly large companies, and they're, of course, very important. They're high emitters, they're significant in their own right. But what we also need to see, and especially this, I think, builds on Rob's point about just transitions, we need to see that this ability to disclose and therefore not just complete a bureaucratic exercise, but really take that opportunity to look internally within a company and say, how are we really affected by climate change? Do we really understand this? How can we change our business model to reduce our impact, but also take advantage of any new opportunities that might be coming our way to position ourselves better for a new future, to help align to that 1.5 degree transition pathway. So CDP is releasing an SME specific questionnaire, and I think that will serve a lot of developing countries more where there is a particularly high prevalence of SMEs. Thanks.
Yeah, that's good. The idea that there isn't this one corporation with one solution, that we actually really need to kind of drive and take account of different contextual factors, different ways of working. Yvonne, What do we need to do?
Thanks. I mean, I really want to build on what both Rob and Claire have said. I think for me, the first thing that really, strikes out is this idea that we need to really almost informalize climate finance. Rob started talking about it, but this idea that, getting the money down to the people who need it is a really apparent challenge, especially on the continent, especially here in Africa. The reality of climate finance is the structures are so formal, but when you look at the African economy, we are predominantly informal in how we operate. Kenya alone, 90% of the businesses here are SMEs, right? So already we're locking out access for these businesses. The other thing is also our informal sector employs 80% of Kenyans. So again, we
was that 80? Was that 80? Yeah.
80, yeah. So I mean, it's striking how there is a complete mismatch in terms of the structure of how climate finance mechanisms are and where it needs to go, because this is the continent where arguably most of the financing needs to be flowing. I think the other real challenge that we're seeing on the ground is that it is the local community-based organizations that are working directly to deal with adaptation questions and resilience issues. They're the ones on the ground. They cannot access. I did some research recently, and it was so interesting to see how you have community organizations that are out there, specifically in the gender justice space, working on climate justice, and they're reaching thousands of women, but they don't even have a website. They don't have a formal ad. So imagine them trying to access the GCF. I mean, it's impossible. But I think also the reality is that even for the larger businesses here in Kenya, some of which I work with, we've been trying to get accredited for the past 3 years, to the GCF. This is a large business. This is not on the scale of not having the right institutional framework. So I think we really need to, something needs to change, because where the money is needed is not where it's going. I think my second point, which is really important to my heart, is that we need to have more people like me, Southern voices in this conversation. When we look at the priorities and how climate finance is being dispersed across the region, we are not part of these conversations. And I see it every day in the work that I do, that where the priorities are, they are not being matched, because you have consultants in the UK sitting down and saying what's going to happen to a small community in Kenya, and there's a complete disconnect, right? So I think there is definitely a need to hear more from our side. And then finally, I talk about the private sector a lot. There is such tremendous capacity to not just harness, but also disperse finance that can speak to adaptation and resilience issues. I think businesses, the appetite is there. Unfortunately, it's a capacity question and a capacity assessment point of view that they don't have this information. So how are we translating it to the people who can actually, be able to influence some decisions?
Yeah, get enough money to the right people in the right places at the right time. The kind of really, so it's simple but kind of really important kind of like attributes of climate finance. Paul, I know you've got lots of expertise in this area. So what do you think we should be, with the climate finance, should be doing?
Thanks, Ian. I want to add, I think, 3 points to all the excellent points that have already been mentioned. First, I think for climate finance to make more impact, we would need more investment in climate actions in more variety of sectors than we are seeing today. If you look at the distribution of how the money was spent, the majority of mitigation finance has gone into renewable energies and transport, while much of the adaptation finance has gone into water and climate resilient infrastructure. These are very important and all are needed investments, but there are actually many more green investment opportunities that will need financing urgently. For example, we need more investment in smart cities that employ sustainable cooling technology to deal with the rising average temperatures that we are facing. We also need more money to invest in the nature-based solutions, particularly the blue and marine sectors. We also need more money to invest at the community level, like all the other speakers have mentioned. So clearly, we would need a more rigorous pipeline of projects in a more variety of sectors. And many developing countries will need technical assistance for project preparation in order to be able to tap into more climate finance. Second point I want to make is that I think we need to apply more innovations, both in terms of the financing instruments and also the climate actions themselves. On the financing side, for example, like the sustainability theme bonds market has been growing tremendously, rapidly globally, and this signifies investor appetite, right, to invest in more climate allied projects. But if you look at where the money is going, take the example of ASEAN right now. Most of the green bond proceeds today have gone into renewable energies and green buildings, while only 3.3% of the proceeds have gone into financing adaptation and resilience. So obviously there is much more scope for this instrument to go into scaling up adaptation finance, adaptation investment as well, particularly through the new labels such as resilience bond. The world has already seen the first labeled climate resilient bonds issued in 2020 by EBRD. So clearly there's a mechanism to do this, and this should be adopted by more market players to channel more money towards adaptation. And the last point is that I really agree with Yvonne that the issue of direct access to international climate fund is very key. Countries need processes that are more friendly to them, less transaction costs, in order to access to the international climate funds that are out there. And also, we also need to think about how to further channel funds to the local communities, right? Sometimes the mechanism of big money envelope might not be the most appropriate financing instruments, but things like community grants that are participatory in the way that they are used could be very relevant and making more impact at the community level.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that. Thanks, everyone. We've got a question from that I think builds on those issues, and it basically is looking at this idea that there's pressure from players in the financial sector to comply with regulation on sustainable investment, and these institutions are requiring more and more criteria before they will invest in diverse funds in climate mitigation or adaptation. But this stricter requirement from the financial institutions seems to be limiting accessibility to climate finance for the organizations that are actually driving climate action. I think that's kind of point that's actually been made. But the people who are they don't necessarily have the expertise to meet this demand from the financial institutions. So how can we maybe ensure that we can we're not missing out opportunities to tackle mitigation and adaptation projects in a developing country, which are arguably poised to face larger impact, but also with the potential to make a difference? Any thoughts on that? Maybe we'll start with you, Claire. It's you maybe they represent more connected with the bigger financial institutions, and maybe we can then draw on maybe Yvonne and Pom to talk about the other side of this. Are you observing something similar?
I'm kind of observing several things, I would say, which align to an extent with what you're talking about. I mean, certainly with the CDP specific hat on, we ran a project through our City, States and Regions programme at CDP, which was to gather all of the projects that city, states and regions had identified and local authorities had identified that they needed to be able to enact to climate mitigation or adaptation projects. But we were
sorry, Claire. I think we've lost the connection. Yep. So I think we'll maybe come back to Claire. Yvonne, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, and I'm speaking from, local experience, local context. The reality is on the ground here, the first requirement, around climate finance initially was have all of the right institutional frameworks in place to be able to access and to be able to monitor and manage whatever finance is flowing. And here in Kenya, I think we've really done that. Our treasury has a policy on climate finance now. Our central bank has guidelines for all banks on how to integrate climate risk into their planning. Our securities exchange, our stock exchange has very clear rules around this and around disclosure. So we've set up all of the different institutional frameworks, and even on a very local level. So Kenya is made up of 47 counties, and now this is, very local sub-national management, and each county has a county climate change plan and fund, right? So we're actually putting money aside to be able to address these issues. Now, we have the institutional frameworks in place, but the reality is that the funds are still not flowing from where they need to flow. That's what we need to address urgency. I think the other thing I wanted to, to your question specifically, and is we really need to think about these issues more contextually. A good example is we are now in the middle of the worst droughts that Kenya has ever experienced, and it's been going on for the past couple of weeks. This has huge, really negative impacts on livelihoods, including the pastoralists. Now, here in Kenya, if you buy a cow, normally, during a normal season, you're buying a cow at $200 to $300, US dollars. Now, pastoralists are being forced to sell their cows for $5, $6 because of this extreme, drought that we're experiencing. How does the financial sector respond to this? Because ultimately, to be able to support such communities, there's still the risk and the likelihood of this happening. So all the financial institutions are, when it comes from an insurance point of view, are going to be scared of getting involved. But at the same time, there is a need to protect these communities. So we really need to think about these issues with context in mind. We talk about, 1.5 degree as 2030, goal. There are parts of Kenya that are already experiencing 1.5 degree shift. It's happening. So these are very tangible, real issues. So you cannot go to a person in Turkana and talk to them about, let's build a renewable energy manufacturing plant. No, their needs are very, very much on resilience and adaptation. That's what we need to speak to. So context is the big issue, and making sure that we match that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, and the other thing is that there's a lack of experts who can provide that information on the ground. And one of the initiatives that we've taken at Birmingham is to integrate this into our accounting undergraduate program, so that every student coming out of university who might work as an accountant and whatever thing knows about this and has the knowledge and capacity to help. Because you go to an expert right now, they can't even help you. In the UK, there's a massive capacity gap. But anyway, we'll come on to accountability later, and I'll call you in, Rob. But Pom, have you got any thoughts on this idea of these requirements that are being placed and how they are restricting kind of finance? However well intentioned these systems are.
I think we are talking about a trade-off between safeguarding the credentials of the green finance or climate finance versus a rapid access to resources. But if we take example from the bond market right now, I think we need to take a little bit of the long-term view, because given the growth of this market, right, there got to be an effort to ensure that finance goes to things that are really green and meet the different standards. And that's why we have seen different taxonomies being developed around the world, and there's an effort to ensure interoperability of these taxonomies. And this is coming from the investor, because they're also accountable to their shareholder, and they want to be sure that they're putting money into assets that are actually making impact, right? So in a way, investing in having this standard usually benefits the countries in the long run by ensuring more access to new sources of capital, including international capital that could be flowing into the country if the country are adhering to the green market standards. However, there is a flip side that not everyone in the country could be complying right away. Smaller players may find it hard to issue green bonds that meets the standard of ICMA, or even in ASEAN, the ASEAN has its own green bond standards. But there are measures that countries are putting in place to do this. For example, within some ASEAN countries, there are grant facilities that the government is setting up to help issuers prepare the bond framework and comply better with the standards. Also, there is an idea that maybe the aggregator can be the one who tap into this kind of instrument, such as the agricultural banks could be the one who issue this bond and then retail the money through other instruments such as green loans. So I think there are ways to balance the two sides.
Yeah, it's again interesting. I think from all the answers so far, this idea we need to collaborate. We need to kind of like talk to the different players in the seeing it as a chain of transactions and a chain of different things, and find a way to connect them. Now, Rob, the next question which has come up is actually about accountability. So I'm going to kind of push to you because I know that that's something dear to your heart. And the question is what other mechanisms are there for ensuring accountability to make sure that the funds flow in the right direction to the right people? And if you like it, I'll add to the question at the time scale that's needed. So that, you know, because that's also critical as well. So accountability and its role in facilitating climate finance.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, and you're quite right, it's dear to my heart. So there's various ways you could talk about this. You could look at this through, say, the development of green taxonomies in setting out what can be credibly considered to be a green activity, and checking whether the funds are going towards those, and really scrutinizing those taxonomies and looking how they evolve. But I'd actually like to come back to a point that Claire made earlier, to point to a more fundamental kind of accountability that we need for decades to come. And this is where Claire was talking about scenarios, and in particular talking about people focusing on the current policy scenario when they're thinking about the future. The issue with this is the current policy scenario is really going to be an underestimate of the policy environment of the future. Policies are getting stronger year on year. So if you look at current policies and current plans, they're going to be the weakest we're likely to see for decades to come. So really, you need to be planning for something slightly stronger than a current policy scenario, because a current policy scenario is effectively a worst case of where we're going. The reason accountability links to this is because it's really at the heart of the Paris Agreement. The reason current policies get stronger year on year is because there is a ratchet agreement at the heart of Paris. And what that means is when governments communicate their plans to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they have to increase the ambition of their targets and their plans. Now, if that works out, then we'll go from current policies where we're on track for between 2 and 3 degrees of warming and get much, much closer to 1.5. And that's the plan. In order for governments to increase the ambition of those policies, though, there has to be a degree of accountability, being held accountable for those targets and how you can ratchet up those targets and increase the ambitions of the plans. The Singaporean government had a fantastic version of this recently, which was putting out for consultation with the public whether their net zero targets were ambitious enough or too ambitious. And the overwhelming consensus from the public was, we can be more ambitious. And that's a great way of having the public voice involved as well. It is a just way of the government saying, yep, let us know what you think. We are willing to go further if you're willing to go further with us. And I think, to me, making sure there's that accountability over what the policies are and that those policies get stronger year on year is critical if we're going to get close to 1.5 degrees. And that is really, if people are planning for policies, that's really going to be fundamental to making climate finance work on the timescale we need.
Yeah. Claire, welcome back. Sorry, you dropped out a little bit. You did warn us. Now, obviously, accountability is key to CDP and has taken a pioneering kind of like position on that. So, what how do you see the role of accountability in ensuring that the funds from climate finance are flow in the right direction, the right place at the right time?
Really interesting question. Again, sorry for my internet connection. I think it's a really interesting question. We actually released a report about a year or two ago on the role of banks and their own sense of accountability. And what it revealed is that portfolios of financed emissions are typically 700 times higher than scope 1 and 2 combined for banks, but only at the time 25% of banks actually disclose those scope 3 emissions, which means most banks have no idea really of the impacts of their financed emissions. What we're seeing now, particularly in the lead up to COP last year, was a huge flurry of excitement and interest around setting net zero ambitions and targets, and that in a sense is positive, albeit there are some concerns around the lack of sufficient standards, I would say, about how to set those targets in a comparable fashion, which also demonstrates accountability. I think the concern for me is it feels like we're still really in the starting blocks with this. You know, we're still very much with banks, by and large, at a point of just looking at ambition and targets, and we're yet to move to action. So I can see this in some practical ways with banks, for example. One example of this is, yes, some of them are setting some really ambitious goals, but when you actually talk to them about, okay, so what are your relationship managers doing? To what extent are you proactively seeking engagement with your clients to understand where they're at today? Are you using reported data or not? Are you actually working with them to understand what their transition plans are? To what extent are you financing those? In most cases, banks will say to you, well, the problem is, you know, X% of my portfolio is covered by reported data, but a significant chunk still isn't. And I'm afraid to ask our clients for this data because I'm concerned that we're going to be seen to be overly bureaucratic and burdensome. And when our competitors aren't doing that, that puts me at a competitive disadvantage, and I don't want to lose the P&L. And instead of having that conversation, because that's just one perspective on disclosure, the flip side, as I've already said, I think, is that actually it's a great opportunity to understand your risk and opportunities better, and actually then to take that step in partnership with the clients to take them on a transition journey and actually secure their business for future and ensure that both of you are more sustainable. So I think we still need to have that practical grassroots mindset shift among banks. We need to make sure that even the relationship managers have incentive packages which are aligned to the degree to which they are discussing sustainable finance as a matter of good hygiene practices with their counterparties. We're not seeing that on the ground to a sufficient volume, I would say, at the moment, and I would like to see that coming through much more. So of course it starts with disclosure from the corporates, but again, that needs to be fed by reported data from real conversations, not just model data, because that doesn't actually tell you enough, and it's not a demonstration of action.
That's brilliant, and it's wonderful because you preempted my my last question. We're moving towards the end. It's a really nice kind of practical way in which we can kind of start to drive these change. I wonder if other panelists can point to some examples of projects that have worked and things that we can learn from things that have worked, or if things haven't worked, that's actually there. Who would like to start? Yvonne, would you like to give it? Have you got any examples of kind of projects or
I'm not sure it's an example of a project, but more just of a perspective, really. And what I'm finding with some of the institutions I work with, there is a very clear sort of desire to do the right thing, right? You have banks, particularly in this country, who are saying we connect very, very seriously with what is happening to our communities. If we don't protect our communities, we don't have clients in the next 10 years, to the way we expect. So we have to make sure that they are taken care of. And so there's this sort of move, if I can say, from thinking about this in terms of a return on investment, what do we need to do to make money, but really how do we protect the communities that we work with? And I see that from a strategic point of view, from the board level, then saying, actually, we just want to do the right thing. How do we do that? But I think something I wanted to point out, especially from the whole accountability point of view, is this idea that, the scale of the problem is something we've never really dealt with before. But it also really calls on us to be more collaborative. And I find in the financial sector, that is an area of struggle. banks competing against each other. That's the reality, right? And there is this reputational benefit and advantage to, you know, being net zero or having certain activities that you're doing to de-risk from the problems associated with climate change. So we need to be aware the traditional way to approach these issues is from a competitive point of view, and how do we change that? That way of thinking, I think, is really, really key. And I guess as my final point, it's two things. We need to interface with the informality. That is key. And the way that climate finance needs to move forward is we need to address that as a serious concern and find ways to engage, whether it's descaling, whether it's budget tagging, whatever it is. We need to have a very serious conversation around how we interact with that informality. And my final point is to what Pom spoke about, is this: we need to have the long-term view. You know, the financial sector in particular, we are used to thinking about when are we going to see results in the now. We need to realize that these are long-term engagements to see long-term results and be willing to put our money towards that.
Wonderful. We're running sort of short of time, so I don't want to. Pom, have you got an example that of something that could help?
Yeah, sure. I think if you're working on climate actions in developing country, identifying the appropriate institutional arrangement is a key to successful delivery. And a quick example from a project I used to work with in weather insurance. The project wanted to expand access to weather insurance coverage for small farmers, but to reach them individually, the transaction cost would be very high. So one of the solutions was to partner with agricultural banks who already have strong outreach to the farmers, and they could be a great partner in expanding access to the insurance products to this farmer at a more cost-effective ways. And in some cases, you can even bundle these insurance products with loans. And in this case, it would add values both to the banks and to the farmers. So I think that is an example of what has worked. And just a 30-second, I want to add one point on the issue of accountability, that for climate finance, to ensure more accountability, we also need to be tracking climate finance better. For example, currently there is no standardized methodology or community markers in the way in the way climate finance are spent, and we need to know how much and what money is used for what at the community level. And also we have quite scarce information on adaptation finance investment in the private sector, and also in sectors such as buildings or industrial processes. So we need more data and more methodology to keep track better of how climate finance is spent.
Thank you. Rob, 30 seconds.
Yes, of course. For I think a quick 30 seconds, one of the most impactful projects I've seen in the last 10, 12 years has really been the work by Carbon Tracker, communicating the systemic threat climate change poses to the financial system. I think a useful iteration on that would be to find a form of that that encapsulates not just climate change, but sustainable development as a whole. Because I think when you then start working in developing countries, you find that, yes, a climate change narrative does gain traction, but there are competing priorities around poverty, around biodiversity, around all these other issues that take hold. So we need a new form of that carbon tracker work, essentially, to really grab the regulators from a slightly more rounded and balanced view of what sustainable development looks like.
Thank you. It just really leaves me with the last minute to thank our fantastic panel and the audience for joining us today. I'm sure you'll agree this was an invigorating conversation with many kind of like possibilities and practical ways forward, as well as some strong conceptual and perhaps kind of challenges for the politicians as well as the finance sector. And so as we get ready for COP, I think we'll need to be keeping an eye out and holding the COP26 to account on the commitments and tangible actions the world leaders will set to ensure every nation, including the UK, where Prime Minister has just suddenly agreed, he's managed to find some time in his diary to actually make it. So at least we'll be kind of like the UK will be represented for these things. But it's critical that every nation and its people are protected from climate threats. Please don't forget the RSK final panel, the road to EUE will kick off at 12 GMT, so register and join the conversation. And a final shout, just on this slide, I'm kind of involved with a small charity in the UK called Carbon Copy, and they've been doing one of the world's biggest relays called Running Out of Time, which actually started off as a continuous road relay, people running from Glasgow to Sharm el Sheikh. And they're currently, I think they've just passed Tel Aviv, so they've managed to get there. So a big shout out to the Running Out of Time and Carbon Copy people for doing a wonderful job in bringing this to attention. You can tune into a recording of the session later, and please do share on the social media hashtags. And again, a final thank you to everyone. It's been absolutely kind of wonderful session. I've enjoyed every second of it, and I wish there was a few more seconds, but goodbye to everyone. Thank you.